They stopped the plane with her already strapped in. The seatbelt light was still glowing. The cabin door was still open. And the pilot's voice, calm but clipped, came through the overhead speaker like a verdict being read. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to pause boarding for a moment. There's an issue that needs to be addressed." Heads turned. A few sighs. Somewhere, a suitcase thudded against the jet bridge wall. In seat 21A, a 16-year-old black girl froze, her fingers tightening around the frayed strap of a canvas backpack she'd owned since middle school. Her name was Emily Carter. She looked small in the wide leather seat, knees tucked in, sneakers barely touching the floor. Her hoodie was zipped all the way up, even though the cabin was warm. The man in the aisle seat beside her glanced over, then away, as if looking too long might pull him into something he did not want to be part of. Emily could feel it before anyone said a word, that familiar tightening in her chest, the sense that the air itself had shifted. A flight attendant stopped beside her row, mid-40s, perfect hair, smile that never reached the eyes. "Sweetheart," she said softly, too softly, crouching to Emily's level. "Can you come with me for just a second?" Emily swallowed. Her mouth was dry. "Is something wrong?" she asked. The flight attendant's smile flickered. "We just need to double-check a few things." The words were gentle. The tone was not. From the cockpit doorway, Captain Michael Reynolds watched the interaction through narrowed eyes. He had flown for this airline longer than Emily had been alive. He knew procedures. He knew risks. And lately, he knew fear. Fear of headlines, fear of lawsuits, fear of being the man whose name ended up attached to the wrong decision at the wrong time. He told himself this was routine. He told himself it had nothing to do with the girl's skin, her age, the way she sat so still it almost looked like guilt. He told himself a lot of things. Emily stood slowly, aware of every gaze following her as she stepped into the aisle. Her backpack brushed against the armrests. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered, "What's going on?" She wanted to disappear, or scream, or both. Instead, she followed the flight attendant toward the front, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the whole cabin could hear it. At the galley, another crew member waited. Younger, nervous, hands clasped too tight. "She's a minor," he murmured, not as quietly as he thought. Emily heard it. The word minor landed like a stamp pressed onto her forehead. She straightened. "I'm allowed to fly alone," she said, voice shaking despite her effort. "I have my ticket. I have my ID." The flight attendant nodded, still smiling. "Of course you do. We just need to confirm a few details with the captain." Behind them, the jet bridge hummed. Outside, engines idled, a low mechanical growl that felt like impatience. Inside the cockpit, Reynolds ran through the file again on his tablet. Unaccompanied minor. Booked correctly. Emergency contact listed. No red flags. None that were visible, anyway. But visible was not the same as safe. He thought of the training videos, the compliance seminars, the lawsuits that started with one sentence. The airline failed to act. A murmur rose from the cabin. An older woman near the front leaned into the aisle. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice edged with concern, not accusation. A man across from her shook his head. "If she's got a ticket, let the kid sit," he muttered. The flight attendant shot them a look sharp enough to cut. "We're handling it, sir." Emily felt the tears burn behind her eyes. She hated that part. Hated that her body betrayed her even when her mind screamed, "Stay calm." "Can I call my dad?" she asked. The flight attendant hesitated. Just a beat. Enough for Emily to notice. "In a moment," she said. "Let's talk to the captain first." Reynolds stepped out of the cockpit then. Tall, grey at the temples, authority in his posture, in the way the noise seemed to dim when he appeared. He looked at Emily, really looked, and something in his expression shifted. Not anger, not kindness, calculation. Emily Carter, he said, reading from the screen. She nodded. You're traveling alone today?
Yes, sir.
Where are you headed?
Savannah. My grandmother's sick.
Her voice cracked on the last word. She hated that, too. Reynolds exhaled slowly. He could feel the eyes on him now, the weight of the moment pressing down. He imagined the after-action report, the what-ifs. We're just going to take a few minutes, he said, measured, professional. We need to verify your guardian information before we can proceed.
It's all there,
Emily said, louder now.
My dad booked the flight. He's my emergency contact. Everything's there.
Reynolds met her gaze. For a split second, doubt crept in. Not about the paperwork, about himself. Let's step off the aircraft, he said. The words landed hard. A collective intake of breath rippled through the cabin. The older woman stood. That's ridiculous, she said. You're delaying all of us over a kid who hasn't done anything. Reynolds turned, his jaw tight. Ma'am, please sit down. Authority reasserted itself. The woman hesitated, then sat, lips pressed thin. Emily's legs felt weak as she turned toward the door. Each step down the aisle felt like a walk of shame. She could hear whispers now, some sympathetic, some annoyed, some sharp enough to sting. At the threshold, she stopped.
Please,
she said, barely above a whisper.
Can I just call my dad?
The flight attendant glanced at Reynolds. He nodded once, quickly. Emily fumbled for her phone, hands shaking. The screen blurred as tears finally spilled over. She wiped them away angrily and pressed call. It rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice, calm and steady, answered. Anne? Relief hit her so hard, her knees nearly buckled.
David,
she breathed.
They're making me get off the plane.
There was a pause on the other end. Not confusion, not panic. Silence. Heavy. Controlled. Where are you? He asked.
Gate C7. They stopped the flight.
Another pause. Longer this time. Stay right there, he said. His voice was low now. Different. I'm on my way. Emily looked up as the call ended. The pilot was watching her, his expression unreadable. Somewhere beyond the glass, the afternoon sun glinted off metal and concrete. The engines continued to idle, patient, relentless. And none of them knew it yet, but the delay they had just ordered was about to become something else entirely. The jet bridge felt colder than the cabin, the air sharper, stripped of pretense. Emily stood just outside the aircraft door, arms wrapped around herself, watching the plane that was supposed to carry her south sit frozen in place. A ground crew worker paused at the bottom of the stairs, headset crooked, eyes darting between the cockpit window and the gate desk. No one spoke to her. No one met her eyes. That silence was louder than the engine hum. Captain Reynolds remained at the threshold, one hand resting on the doorframe. From this angle, he could see the whole stage he had created. A teenage girl standing alone. A line of impatient passengers sealed inside aluminium and leather. A schedule bleeding minutes. He told himself he was doing the responsible thing. He told himself restraint now prevented catastrophe later. But beneath that story lived another truth he did not like to touch. Once he had decided she was a risk, everything else had bent to support that conclusion. The flight attendant who had first approached Emily shifted her weight, heels clicking against the floor. Her name tag read Karen Mills. She had practiced that soft voice for years, learned how to sound concerned without sounding apologetic. But now, with the girl crying quietly beside her, the performance felt thinner. "Your father is on his way," Karen said, trying to steady the moment. "This will all be cleared up." Emily nodded, not trusting her voice. Inside the cabin, the murmurs grew teeth.
A man in a business jacket checked his watch for the third time in a minute. "We're going to miss our connection," he said to no one in particular. An older black man 2 rows back leaned into the aisle. "She didn't cause this," he said, loud enough to be heard. "You all did." Karen turned sharply. "Sir, please remain seated." "I am seated," he replied, calm, unblinking. The tension thickened, stretched tight as wire. At the gate desk, the station supervisor arrived, summoned by a terse message from the cockpit. His name was Thomas Avery, late 40s, clean-cut,
The kind of man who believed deeply in procedure, because procedure kept the world predictable. He listened as Karen spoke in a low rush, eyes flicking to Emily, then to Reynolds. Avery nodded slowly. "We need documentation," he said, "and a record of the delay." His gaze lingered on Emily a moment longer than necessary. Not hostile, appraising, measuring how much trouble she might become. Emily noticed. She always noticed. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text from her father. "I am parking. Be there in minutes." Relief washed through her, followed by a spike of fear she did not fully understand. She trusted her father more than anyone, but she also knew what it meant when his voice went quiet, when his words became precise. That was not comfort. That was preparation. Reynolds returned to the cockpit, the door sliding shut behind him with a heavy click. He sat in his seat but did not start the checklist. His first officer glanced over. "You sure about this?" Reynolds didn't answer right away. Through the windshield, he could see the terminal windows, the slow movement of people behind glass. "I want this clean," he said finally. "No mistakes." The first officer nodded, though doubt crept into his eyes. Clean was no longer possible. The moment for that had passed. 10 minutes stretched into 15. The delay rippled outward, screens updating, connections tightening. A call came in from operations asking for an explanation. Reynolds gave one that sounded reasonable. Verification, minor passenger, standard protocol. The words were correct. The context was not. Emily sat on a plastic chair near the gate now, offered water she did not touch. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a hollow ache behind her ribs. She watched people walk past, some staring, some pretending not to. She felt smaller here, out in the open, than she had in the seat. Like the removal itself was the point. Then she saw him. At first, it was just the jacket. Blue, worn at the seams, the white letters across the back unmistakable, even from a distance. NASA. The crowd parted without realizing why, drawn by something they could not name. Emily stood so fast the chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Dad," she whispered. David Carter moved with a quiet urgency that made space around him. 62 years old, grey hair cropped short, posture straight despite the years. The jacket hung loose on his frame, patched at the elbow, sun faded in places. He had worn it to meetings with senators, to classrooms full of children, to funerals of men who had never made it home. It was not a symbol to him. It was history. He reached Emily and pulled her into his chest without a word. She pressed her face against the familiar fabric, breathing in the scent of machine oil and laundry soap. For a moment, the world narrowed to that embrace. Then David lifted his head. His eyes found Captain Reynolds across the gate. Reynolds felt it like a physical blow. Recognition sparked, uninvited. Not the man, not exactly. The jacket, the bearing, the way other staff straightened without knowing why. He stepped forward, suddenly aware of the eyes now turning toward him. "Sir," he said, extending a hand, "I'm Captain Reynolds." David did not take it. "I know who you are," he said calmly. His voice was even, controlled, but there was steel beneath it. "You removed my daughter from your aircraft." Reynolds opened his mouth,
then closed it. Avery appeared at his shoulder, sensing escalation. "Mr. Carter," Avery said, glancing at the phone in David's hand. "We're just ensuring compliance with—" "My daughter is in compliance," David cut in. He held up his phone, screen glowing. "Her documents, your policy, your logs, all time-stamped, all correct." Silence fell. Not the awkward kind, the heavy kind. The kind that settles when people realize a story is about to change.
David turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the nearby passengers, the crew, the supervisors. "I spent 35 years designing systems where failure was not an option," he said, "where assumptions killed people, where hesitation had consequences. I taught my daughter to follow the rules because rules matter. You followed a feeling instead." Reynolds swallowed. The first officer had stepped out behind him now, eyes wide. Karen stood frozen, her practiced smile gone. Avery shifted, uncomfortable. "Sir," he began. David raised a hand. Not aggressive. Final. "You delayed a flight," David continued. "You isolated a child. You did it publicly. And you did it without cause." He turned back to Reynolds, locking eyes. "So now you have a choice. You can correct this, or you can explain it, in writing, to people who will ask harder questions than I will." For the first time since this began, Reynolds felt the ground move under him. He looked at Emily, really looked, at the red eyes, the clenched jaw, the way she stood tall despite everything. Something inside him cracked. He nodded once. "We're resuming boarding," he said. His voice carried farther than he expected. "Ms. Carter will return to her seat." A breath released across the gate, collective and sharp. A woman clapped once before stopping herself. Emily looked up at her father, disbelief flickering across her face. David gave a small nod. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll be right here." As Emily walked back down the jet bridge, shoulders straighter now, the engines began their low growl again. But this time it sounded different. Not impatience. Momentum. And behind her, David Carter remained standing at the gate, the NASA jacket bright under fluorescent lights, watching until the door closed, already knowing this was not over. The cabin felt different when Emily stepped back inside. Quieter, heavier. Conversations cut off mid-sentence as she walked down the aisle, every step measured, every breath controlled. The seat that had felt like a trap now felt like a line she had crossed and survived. She slid into 21A, fingers brushing the armrest, grounding herself in something solid. The man beside her gave a small nod this time. Not avoidance. Recognition. From the cockpit, Captain Reynolds watched the cabin settle through the cracked door. His pulse had not slowed. It thudded in his ears, loud enough to drown out the checklist running on his screen. He had resumed boarding. He had done the right thing. Too late, a voice whispered. He pushed it down. There would be time for reflection later. For now, there was a flight to fly. At the gate, David Carter did not sit. He stood near the window, hands folded loosely in front of him, posture relaxed in a way that suggested long practice under pressure. Thomas Avery hovered a few feet away, phone pressed to his ear, murmuring updates to someone higher up the chain. Karen Mills had retreated behind the desk, eyes fixed on the monitor, a reflection staring back at her from the dark screen. The confidence she had worn earlier had drained away, leaving something brittle in its place. Avery ended the call and cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully. "We're documenting the incident. Standard procedure." David inclined his head. "Good," he replied. "Documentation matters." Avery hesitated, then added, "If you'd like to file a formal complaint." David's gaze remained steady. "I already have." That landed harder than any raised voice could have. Inside the cabin, the final door sealed shut with a hollow thump. The safety demonstration began, familiar and oddly soothing. Emily stared at the card in the seat back pocket, the diagrams blurring as her thoughts raced. Her phone vibrated. A message from her father lit up the screen. "I'm here. You're not alone." She swallowed, blinking fast, and typed back, "Thank you." Another pause, then his reply, "I'm proud of you." Her chest tightened. This time the feeling was something close to relief. As the plane pushed back, Reynolds felt the movement through the frame, a subtle shift that signaled commitment. No turning back now. He focused on the runway ahead, the lines stretching out under the afternoon light. He had flown thousands of takeoffs. This one felt heavier than most. "Cleared for departure," came the tower's voice. Reynolds acknowledged, his own voice steady, professional, betraying nothing. The aircraft surged forward. Engines roared. The ground fell away. At the gate, the crowd dispersed, drawn back into their own itineraries, their own small urgencies. But not everyone forgot. An older woman lingered near David, purse clutched to her chest. "Sir," she said softly, "you did right by her." David met her eyes. "We all have a responsibility," he replied. She nodded, then moved on. Avery approached again, this time without the phone. "Corporate will want a statement," he said. "They'll reach out." David adjusted the cuff of his jacket. "They already have my contact information." His tone was polite, final. Avery shifted, then extended a hand. This time, David took it. The handshake was brief, transactional, not forgiveness. As the plane climbed, Emily felt the pressure change in her ears, the familiar pop grounding her back in the physical world. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the vibration of the cabin wash over her. The worst was over, or so it felt. She did not yet know how moments like this echoed, how they lingered, how they reshaped the way you moved through the world. In the cockpit, Reynolds handed control to his first officer and leaned back slightly, the autopilot engaged. Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, the first officer spoke. "That was close." Reynolds nodded. "Closer than it should have been." He stared ahead, jaw tight. "I let fear make the call." The admission surprised him with its ease. The first officer glanced over, said nothing. Sometimes, acknowledgement was enough. On the ground, David Carter walked toward the exit, the NASA jacket drawing glances as it had always done. Outside, the air was warmer, the noise sharper. He paused near a bank of windows, watching the plane lift into the sky, a silver shape against blue. His phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number, corporate communications. He did not open it yet. He thought of the years he had spent in rooms where mistakes were dissected, where accountability was not optional. He thought of Emily, sitting on that plane, learning something he had hoped she would not have to learn so soon. The world had not changed in 15 minutes. But something had shifted. Lines had been drawn. Records made. David finally tapped the message open. A request for a call. An apology offered in advance. He typed a brief response. "We'll talk after you've reviewed the footage and the logs." He slid the phone back into his pocket. Above him, the contrail stretched thin and white, fading slowly into the afternoon sky. David adjusted the jacket on his shoulders and turned toward the parking garage, his steps unhurried. This had never been about authority, or reputation, or the letters stitched onto worn fabric. It had been about a choice, made under pressure, and the reminder that even small decisions carried weight. And somewhere, at cruising altitude, a 16-year-old girl looked out the window, watching the land fall away, carrying with her the knowledge that she had been tested, underestimated, and still allowed to rise.
The call came while the plane was leveling off, the seatbelt sign still lit. The cabin wrapped in that brief, suspended quiet that followed takeoff. Captain Reynolds glanced at the console, then at the first officer. Operations. He hesitated for half a second too long before answering. "Reynolds," he said. His voice sounded older than it had an hour ago. "Captain," the voice on the other end replied, clipped, controlled. "We're initiating a formal review of the delay at Gate C7. We'll need a preliminary statement before landing." Reynolds closed his eyes briefly. There it was. Not anger, not accusation. Procedure. The kind that carried consequences without raising its voice. "Understood," he said. The line went dead. In seat 21A, Emily felt the vibration shift as the aircraft settled into cruise. The city below had shrunk into patterns of light and shadow. From this height, everything looked orderly, simple. She pressed her forehead lightly against the window, the cool glass calming her racing thoughts. Her phone buzzed again, another message from her father. They're asking questions now. That's how it should be. Emily stared at the words, then typed back, "Are you okay?" The reply came almost instantly. "I've been okay for a long time. Today just reminded me why."
2 rows behind her, the older black man who had spoken up earlier leaned across the aisle. "You did good," he said quietly. Emily turned, surprised. He offered a small smile. "Takes guts to stand there when everyone's watching." Emily nodded, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she managed. He leaned back, satisfied, the moment complete. In the galley, Karen Mills wiped down a counter that was already clean. She had been reassigned mid-flight, pulled from cabin duties pending review. No one said it out loud, but she felt it in the way the lead attendant avoided her eyes, in the sudden formality of every exchange. She replayed the scene in her head, searching for the moment where it had gone wrong. The smile, the word sweetheart, the assumption she had not known she was making until it was too late. For the first time in years, doubt crept in, unwelcome and persistent. On the ground, David Carter sat in his car, engine off, phone balanced in his hand as the airport traffic flowed past. Another message came through. Legal. Then communications. Then a number he recognized from an old contact list. Federal liaison. He exhaled slowly. The jacket lay folded on the passenger seat beside him, the NASA logo half hidden. He had not worn it on purpose. It had simply been what he had on. But symbols had a way of finding meaning, whether you intended them or not. He thought back to his years at the agency, to the meetings where young engineers were dismissed because they did not fit the room, to the quiet battles fought not with speeches, but with data, patience, and refusal to yield. He had learned early that systems rarely broke all at once. They failed through small decisions, unchecked habits, moments of convenience. Today had been one of those moments. His phone rang. He answered without looking at the screen. "Carter," he said. "Mr. Carter," a woman's voice replied. Older, polished. "This is Elaine Porter from Corporate Affairs." "First, let me say how sorry we are for what your daughter experienced today." David listened, expression unreadable. The apology continued, carefully worded, legally sound. When she finished, there was a pause. "I appreciate the call," David said finally. "But apologies are conclusions. I'm still interested in causes." Silence. Then, "We'd like to understand your concerns." David glanced at the sky, now empty where the plane had been. "Then you'll review your training protocols," he said. "Your escalation policies. And the footage. All of it. We'll talk after." Inside the cockpit, Reynolds dictated notes into the recorder, his words precise, factual. He did not soften the timeline, He did not omit the hesitation. He felt exposed, strangely lighter for it. When he finished, he sat back, staring at the instruments. Flying had always been about control. Today had taught him something about humility. The first officer broke the silence. "Think this changes things?" Reynolds considered the question. "I think it should," he said. "Whether it will is up to more people than us." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the afternoon wore on. Passengers settled into the quiet rituals of flight. Emily pulled her hoodie tighter around her shoulders, exhaustion seeping in now that the adrenaline had faded. She thought of her grandmother, of the hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and tea, of the reason she had boarded this plane in the first place. The world had tried to stop her. It had not succeeded. When the plane began its descent, the seatbelt sign chimed again. Emily straightened, muscles tensing out of habit. But this time, the sound did not carry dread. It was just a signal, a transition. As the wheels touched down, a ripple of applause moved through the cabin, spontaneous and brief. Emily blinked, startled, then smiled despite herself. At the gate in Savannah, Captain Reynolds stood at the door as passengers disembarked. When Emily reached him, he met her eyes. "Miss Carter," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." The words were simple, unadorned. They landed with weight. Emily nodded. "Thank you," she replied. It was not forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. Sometimes that was enough to begin. David waited beyond security, leaning against a column, jacket back on his shoulders. When Emily spotted him, she broke into a run, backpack bouncing against her back. He caught her easily, arms wrapping tight. "You made it," he said into her hair. "So did you," she replied. Around them, travelers moved on, lives intersecting only for moments before diverging again. The incident would become a report, a meeting, a case study. For some, a lesson. For others, an inconvenience quickly forgotten. But for Emily and her father, it would remain something else. A line drawn. A moment when standing still would have been easier, and moving forward had mattered. As they walked toward the exit together, David felt the weight of the jacket on his shoulders, familiar and steady. He did not look back at the gate. There would be time for follow-ups, for calls, for accountability. For now, there was just this. A daughter beside him, the hum of the terminal, and the quiet certainty that even in a system built on routine, change still began with a single decision: to speak, to stop, to insist on being seen. The story did not end at the gate. It rarely did. By the next morning, the footage had been pulled from 3 different angles: gate cameras, cabin phones, a security feed that caught Emily standing alone beneath fluorescent lights, backpack clutched to her chest like armor. No one edited it for drama. It did not need help. The pauses spoke for themselves. The hesitation, the way authority leaned in one direction without being told to. David Carter sat at his kitchen table as the sun came up, the video playing silently on his tablet. Coffee went untouched beside him. He watched Captain Reynolds' posture change when the call came in, watched Karen Mills's smile collapse when the words "minor passenger" were said out loud, watched his daughter blink hard, forcing herself to stay upright. He did not rewind. He did not need to. The sequence had already etched itself into memory. His phone buzzed again. This time it was not corporate. It was an old colleague from Houston, retired now, white hair, quiet reputation. "Saw the footage," the text read. "You want this handled quietly or correctly?" David stared at the words for a long moment. Then he typed back, "Correctly." At the airline's regional headquarters, a conference room filled before 9. Legal, operations, human resources, training.
A screen at the front displayed a paused frame of the incident. Emily, frozen mid-step. Reynolds half-turned, Karen just behind him. No one spoke at first. The image was damning not because it was explosive, but because it was ordinary. Elaine Porter sat at the head of the table, hands folded. She had spent 3 decades managing crises. This one unsettled her. "We are not here to assign villains," she said carefully. "We are here to understand failure." A lawyer cleared his throat. "There was no policy violation," he began. Elaine held up a finger. "Not on paper," she said. "That's the problem." In Savannah, Emily sat at the kitchen counter while her grandmother dozed in the next room. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. Safe smells. Familiar ones. She scrolled through her phone, half expecting to see her face everywhere. It was not. Not yet. A local station had mentioned a delay. A minor passenger. No names, no photos. She exhaled slowly. Part of her wanted the story told. Part of her wanted it buried. Both feelings lived side by side, uncomfortable but honest. David joined her, setting down a glass of water. "They're reviewing it," he said. Emily nodded. "Are you mad?" she asked. He considered the question. "I'm focused," he replied. She smiled faintly. That was his version of anger. Controlled. Directed. Danger, only to the problem itself. Back at headquarters, Karen Mills sat alone in a smaller room, a representative beside her flipping through notes. She had not slept. The memory looped relentlessly. The way she had crouched, the word sweetheart. She had meant to calm. She had assumed. "I've been doing this for 20 years, she said quietly. "I thought I was helping." The representative nodded, sympathetic but distant. "Intent matters," he said, "but impact matters more." Captain Reynolds joined a separate call from the hotel near the airport where he had stayed overnight. He spoke plainly. He did not minimize. He did not excuse. "I made a decision under pressure," he said, "and I let an assumption fill in where verification should have been enough." There was a pause. Someone asked, "Would you make the same call again?" Reynolds answered without hesitation. "No." The room went quiet. Elaine closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "That," she said, "is where this starts." She turned to training. "Pull the modules. All of them. Especially the ones we rush through. To operations. Map the escalation paths, where discretion becomes bias. To legal. We are not waiting for a demand letter." The lawyer frowned. "That exposes us." Elaine met his gaze. "So does denial." By afternoon, a draft plan circulated. Mandatory retraining, revised protocols for minor passengers, clearer language, less room for instinct, more for evidence. It was thorough, expensive, necessary. Still, something felt incomplete. David received the call just after lunch. Elaine's voice was steady. "Mr. Carter, we've completed an initial review," she said. "We'd like to meet." David glanced at Emily, who sat at the table doing homework, pencil tapping softly against the page. "Tomorrow," he said, "in person." The meeting took place in a modest office, not a boardroom. No skyline views, no marble, just a table, chairs, and a pot of coffee that had been brewing too long. Elaine arrived with 2 others. David came alone. He did not bring the jacket this time. He wore a simple button-down, sleeves rolled up. Elaine spoke first. She outlined the findings, the changes, the commitments. When she finished, she folded her hands. "We failed your daughter," she said. The words were not rehearsed. David studied her face. He believed her. Belief was not enough. "What happens to them?" he asked. Elaine did not dodge.
Karen Mills is on leave, pending retraining and review, she said. Captain Reynolds has been grounded temporarily and reassigned to simulator duty. David nodded slowly. And the system? He asked. Elaine hesitated. We're fixing it, she said. That takes time. David leaned back. Then you should start now. He slid a folder across the table. Not thick, just a few pages. Elaine opened it, her brow furrowing as she read. A proposal. Independent oversight for bias-related incidents. External audits. Community advisory input. Not punishment. Structure. Accountability without spectacle. This is ambitious, Elaine said. David met her eyes. So is flight, he replied. Silence followed. Not hostile. Considered. Finally, Elaine nodded. We can do this, she said. It won't be easy. David stood. It wasn't supposed to be. Outside, the afternoon light slanted low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. David walked to his car, feeling the weight of the day settle in his bones. He was tired. But it was the clean kind of tired. The kind that came from moving something heavy in the right direction. That evening, Emily finished her homework and sat beside him on the couch. Are they going to change things? She asked. David looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes. They're going to try, he said. She nodded. That was enough for now. Somewhere above them, planes traced invisible lines across the sky, each one a promise built on trust. Systems, people, decisions. None of them perfect. All of them capable of better. And in that small living room, a father and daughter sat together, knowing that the moment had passed, but its echo would carry forward, shaping choices yet to be made. The formal statement went out 3 days later, buried halfway down the airline's website, written in language that sounded careful, restrained, almost apologetic without ever naming fear. It acknowledged a delay involving a minor passenger. It confirmed an internal review. It promised improvements. For most readers, it would register as background noise in a busy news cycle. For those inside the system, it landed like a quiet warning shot. Inside a training center outside Atlanta, a group of senior instructors sat in a windowless room watching the footage on a large screen. No sound, just faces, body language. The moment when procedure slipped and assumption stepped in. One instructor, a woman with 30 years in aviation safety, leaned forward. Pause it there, she said. The screen froze on Karen Mills's hand, hovering just inches from Emily's arm. That, the instructor said, tapping the screen, is where discretion turns into bias. Not because of malice, because of comfort, because no one taught her how to stop. The room stayed silent. No one argued. Captain Reynolds arrived at the simulator facility that same morning, his uniform jacket folded over his arm instead of worn. The badge on his chest still carried weight, but not authority. Not today. A younger instructor met him at the door. You'll be running scenario sets, she said. Minor passengers, edge cases. Reynolds nodded. He welcomed it. The cockpit mock-up smelled of plastic and recycled air. Familiar, but stripped of prestige. He strapped in anyway, hands steady, ready to be corrected. Across the country, David Carter received an unexpected invitation. A community forum, not a press event, no cameras. Just a room of airline employees, managers, and a few local leaders who wanted to talk without scripts. He hesitated before accepting. Then he thought of Emily standing at the gate, backpack tight against her chest. He agreed. The forum took place in a union hall near the airport. Folding chairs, bad coffee, honest faces. David did not wear the NASA jacket. He did not need it. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. I'm not here to punish, he said. I'm here because systems don't change unless the people inside them feel the moment. A man in the back crossed his arms. So what do you want? He asked. Not hostile, just tired. David met his gaze. I want you to pause, he said, before the assumption, before the shortcut, before you decide someone doesn't belong. Emily did not attend. She was back in school, back in routine. But the incident followed her in quieter ways. In the way teachers watched her a little more closely. In the way friends asked questions they didn't know how to phrase. One afternoon, a guidance counselor called her in. If you ever want to talk about what happened, she said gently. Emily shrugged. I talk about it with my dad. The counselor smiled. That's good, she said. Not everyone has that. At headquarters, Elaine Porter reviewed the feedback from the forum. Some of it stung. Some of it surprised her. One comment stood out. A baggage handler wrote, "We don't need more rules. We need permission to slow down." Elaine underlined the sentence twice. She forwarded it to operations with a single note. Read this. The revised protocols rolled out quietly. No slogans, no glossy videos. Just clear steps, mandatory pauses, defined escalation, a requirement that any removal of a miner from an aircraft be reviewed by 2 independent parties before action. It added minutes. It added friction. It added protection. Karen Mills completed her retraining in silence. She sat through the modules. Watched the footage again, this time with commentary. She wrote a statement she never sent, apologizing to a girl she did not know how to reach. When she returned to duty weeks later, her smile was different, less practiced, more cautious. Some colleagues noticed, some did not. Captain Reynolds completed his simulator sessions and returned to the line. His first flight back, he paused longer than necessary during boarding, watching a family settle in, watching a teenager argue quietly with her mother, watching people be people. His first officer raised an eyebrow. Reynolds shook his head slightly. Not yet. Let it breathe. David Carter declined a follow-up interview request from a national outlet. This isn't a headline, he said. It's a process. Instead, he spent his evenings reviewing policy drafts, offering notes when asked, stepping back when not. He understood now that his role was not to lead the change, but to insist it continue after he left the room. One evening, Emily found the NASA jacket draped over the back of a chair. She ran her fingers over the worn fabric, the stitched letters. Do you think they listened because of this? She asked. David looked at the jacket, then at her. I think they listened because they were ready, he said. Sometimes it just takes the right moment to make people hear. Outside, a plane passed overhead, lights blinking against the darkening sky. Emily watched it until it disappeared. She thought of the gate, the silence, the pause before everything shifted. She understood now that change did not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived quietly, carried forward by people willing to stop, look again, and choose differently. And somewhere, in training rooms and cockpits and meeting halls, that choice was being practiced, again and again. The ripple reached farther than anyone expected. 6 weeks after the incident, a regional safety bulletin circulated through airline inboxes across the country. It did not mention Emily Carter by name. It did not mention Savannah or Gate C7. But every pilot, every flight attendant, every station supervisor recognized the case study the moment they read it. A minor passenger, a discretionary delay, an escalation that should have stopped earlier. The language was clinical. The implication was not. At a retirement community outside Dayton, Ohio, Captain Harold Hal Monroe read the bulletin on his tablet while sipping weak coffee in the common room. 72 years old,
38 years in the cockpit before mandatory retirement grounded him for good. He shook his head slowly. "About time," he muttered. A man across the table looked up. "About time for what?" Hal tapped the screen. "For them to admit we taught a whole generation to trust their gut more than their checklist." He leaned back, eyes distant. And the gut not always clean. That same afternoon, Captain Reynolds stood at a lectern in a small auditorium, facing a room full of pilots in recurrent training. He had been asked to speak, not as an example, as a witness. The request had unsettled him more than any disciplinary memo. He did not wear his jacket, just a shirt, sleeves rolled up. When he began, his voice was steady, but the room could feel the weight behind it. "I thought I was protecting the airline," he said. "I thought I was protecting myself." He paused, scanning the faces. Some skeptical, some attentive, some uncomfortably familiar with the logic. What I was really doing was filling in blanks I had no right to fill. He described the moment, the hesitation, the choice. He did not dramatize it. He did not soften it. When he finished, no one applauded. They did not need to. In Savannah, Emily stood on a small stage in her high school auditorium, hands gripping a folded piece of paper. She had been asked to speak at an assembly about travel safety. She almost said no. Then she thought of the silence at the gate, the way silence could feel like agreement. She cleared her throat and began. "I didn't think I was brave," she said. "I thought I was going to be sick." A ripple of quiet laughter eased the room. "I followed the rules. I still got singled out. That messes with your head." She looked up, meeting eyes. But what helped wasn't someone yelling. It was someone standing next to me and saying, "Stop." She did not mention her father by name. She did not have to. Afterward, a teacher approached her, eyes shining. "You made them listen," she said. Emily shook her head. "They were already listening," she replied. "They just needed a reason." David Carter heard about the assembly through a neighbor before Emily told him herself. He listened as she described it over dinner, pride quiet but unmistakable in his expression. "You know," he said, "there are people twice your age who still haven't figured out how to do that." Emily smiled. "Stand there?" she asked. "Tell the truth," he corrected. At the airline, the changes continued, uneven and imperfect. Some managers embraced them. Others complied because compliance was safer than resistance. A few quietly retired earlier than planned. New hires were trained differently from day one. Less mythology, more responsibility. The phrase, "slow the moment," began to appear in internal notes, then in briefing rooms, then in habit. Karen Mills transferred to a different route. Fewer minors, fewer edge cases. She carried the memory with her anyway. Sometimes, when a young passenger approached her podium, she paused longer than necessary. Asked one more question. Listened to the answer. The habit cost her seconds. She paid them willingly. David declined another request, this one from a policy institute that wanted him on a panel. "I'm not the story," he said, "and I don't want to become the shortcut." He knew how easily attention could slide into performance, how quickly systems leaned on symbols instead of substance. He stayed where he was most useful. Quiet, available, insistent when needed. Months later, at a different airport, a different gate, a different teenager stood uncertainly at the podium, ticket in hand. A supervisor glanced at the screen, then at the girl. She took a breath. "Let's slow this down," she said. The words came out naturally now. No drama, no spotlight. Just a pause where a pause belonged. The flight departed on time. Emily never knew about that moment. She did not need to. Change rarely announced itself to the people who set it in motion. It moved sideways, backstage, through rooms that looked ordinary and decisions that felt small. But it moved. One evening, as summer settled in, Emily and David sat on the porch watching the sky darken. A plane passed overhead, low and steady, lights blinking in sequence. Emily followed it until it vanished. "Do you think it'll stick?" she asked.
David considered the question, the weight behind it. "Not unless people keep choosing it," he said. "Every time." Emily nodded, absorbing that. She understood now that the moment at the gate had not been an ending. It had been an introduction to the way power really worked, to how dignity was defended, to the fact that being underestimated did not mean being powerless. Above them, the sky stretched wide and indifferent, holding countless paths at once. And somewhere within those paths, a quieter, steadier change continued to take shape, guided not by outrage or spectacle, but by the simple, disciplined act of stopping, seeing, and choosing better. Time did what it always did. It softened the sharpest edges without erasing the mark. By autumn, the story had stopped circulating entirely. No more internal memos, no more quiet meetings. The airline moved on to weather delays and fuel costs, and the ordinary crises that filled executive calendars. For most people, the incident became a footnote. For Emily, it settled deeper, changing the way she noticed things. She noticed how often she scanned rooms now, how quickly she read faces. Authority no longer felt abstract. It felt personal, fragile, conditional. She learned to recognize the moment just before a decision tipped one way or another, the breath people took before choosing comfort over fairness. It made her older in ways school never had. David watched the change with a careful eye. He did not try to shield her from it. He knew better than that. Instead, he talked to her the way he had talked to junior engineers decades earlier, late at night in fluorescent-lit labs. Calm, direct, honest. "You didn't lose anything that day," he told her once, as they washed dishes together. "You gained sight." Emily nodded. She felt that was true, even if it came with a cost. At the airline, Captain Reynolds felt that cost too. It showed up in small hesitations, in the extra second he took before signing off on decisions that once would have felt automatic. Some colleagues teased him about it. Others watched quietly, adjusting their own habits without comment. He no longer needed to be certain he was right. He needed to be certain he was fair. That distinction had changed everything. One afternoon, months later, a memo crossed his desk. A new mentorship program for young passengers interested in aviation careers, inspired by feedback from the Minor Passenger Review. Reynolds stared at the screen longer than necessary. He imagined Emily in that seat, backpack tight against her chest, eyes wide but unbroken. He approved the proposal without edits. Karen Mills encountered her own reckoning in quieter ways. She began volunteering on her days off, tutoring students who reminded her uncomfortably of the girl at the gate. The first few sessions were stiff, awkward. Then something shifted. Listening became easier, assumptions slower to form. She did not talk about the incident. She carried it anyway, like a weight that kept her grounded. Emily's guidance counselor suggested she apply for a summer program focused on leadership and ethics. Emily laughed at first. "I'm not a leader," she said. The counselor raised an eyebrow. "You stood your ground when people older and louder than you tried to move you," she replied. "That counts." Emily thought about it that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the gate in her mind. Not the fear this time. The moment she asked to call her dad. The moment she refused to disappear. She filled out the application the next day. David read her essay when she asked him to. He did not correct a word. He only said, "This sounds like you." She smiled, relieved. She was learning that voice mattered.
that clarity was not something you were born with. It was something you earned by surviving moments that tried to take it from you.
At a regional aviation conference, Elaine Porter spoke on a panel about operational trust. She did not mention names. She did not tell the story outright. But when she said, "Systems fail when we confuse intuition with wisdom," heads nodded across the room. A few people took notes. A few shifted uncomfortably. That was enough. The jacket stayed in the closet most days now, folded, resting. David no longer needed it to make a point. He had made that clear. But sometimes, when Emily passed it on her way out the door, she brushed her fingers against the sleeve. A private reminder. Not of power, of presence. One evening, as winter approached, Emily and David stood at the airport fence near their home, watching planes rise one by one into the darkening sky. The engines roared, then softened as each aircraft climbed. Emily leaned against the cold metal rail. "I don't hate flying," she said suddenly. David looked at her, surprised. "No?" She shook her head. "I hate pretending nothing happened," she said. "But I don't hate the sky." David smiled, a quiet, proud expression. "That's how you know it didn't win," he said. Above them, a plane banked east, lights blinking in steady rhythm. It carried people who would never know her name, who would never hear her story. And that was fine. The change she had helped set in motion did not need recognition to exist. It lived in pauses, in questions asked twice, in decisions slowed just enough to be right. Emily watched until the plane disappeared, then turned back toward the parking lot. Tomorrow would come with its own tests, its own assumptions. But she was ready now. Not because she was fearless, but because she understood something most people took years to learn. Dignity was not granted by permission. It was claimed, quietly, the moment you refused to step aside when you knew you belonged. By the time spring returned, the incident had become a reference point rather than a memory. It showed up in training materials, in policy footnotes, in conversations that started with, "Remember when?" and ended with, "Let's not do that again." The airline never issued a sweeping announcement declaring itself changed. It simply began behaving differently, decision by decision, gate by gate. Emily felt the shift the next time she flew alone. A different airport, a different crew, same nerves. She handed over her boarding pass and waited for the familiar pause, the look, the question that hovered just a beat too long. It didn't come. The agent scanned the ticket, smiled, and waved her through. "Have a good flight," she said, already reaching for the next passenger. Emily walked on, heart racing anyway, then slowing as the jet bridge opened ahead of her. The absence of friction felt strange, almost unreal. She took her seat and exhaled, realizing only then how tightly she had been bracing herself. Captain Reynolds heard about that flight through an internal note praising smooth operations. No incident, no delay, no review required. He read it twice, then closed the file. Success, he had learned, was often invisible. It left no footage, no statements, just people moving forward without harm. He preferred it that way now. Karen Mills received a handwritten card from one of the students she tutored. "Thank you for listening." The words were uneven, written with care. Karen sat at her kitchen table and read them again and again. Listening. She had underestimated the power of that simple act. She tucked the card into a drawer, not as absolution, but as a reminder. David Carter watched all of this from a distance, resisting the urge to check in, to ask for updates, to make sure the changes were holding. He knew how easily vigilance could slide into control. He trusted the structures he had insisted on, not because they were perfect, but because they were shared. Accountability did not belong to one man. It belonged to everyone willing to keep the door open. One afternoon, Emily came home with an acceptance letter in her hand. The leadership program. A full scholarship. She stood in the doorway, eyes bright, disbelief and pride tangled together. "I got in," she said. David smiled, slow and steady. "Of course you did," he replied. She laughed, shaking her head. "No," she said. "I really got in." He pulled her into a hug, the moment grounding them both. That evening, as they sat together, Emily asked a question she had been holding on to for months. "If you hadn't come that day," she said quietly, "what do you think would have happened?" David considered it carefully. "The plane would have left," he said, "and you would have carried that moment alone." Emily nodded, absorbing the weight of it. "But you did come," she said. David met her gaze. "Yes," he said. "And someday, you'll be the one who shows up for someone else." Outside, the sky shifted through shades of dusk, planes carving silent paths overhead. Emily watched them, feeling something settle into place. The story had started with a stop, a pause, a moment of doubt. It was ending differently, with movement, with direction, with the quiet understanding that while systems could fail, people could still choose to be better than the moment asked them to be. And that choice, she knew now, was the real journey. The room was quieter than Emily expected. No cameras, no banners, just a long table, a wall of windows, and a view of planes lifting into the sky in steady intervals, their engines a distant pulse. The meeting had been scheduled for late afternoon, when the building thinned out and decisions had space to breathe. Emily sat beside her father, hands folded, posture composed, the calm of someone who had learned how to hold her ground without hardening. Across from them, Elaine Porter adjusted a folder and waited until the door clicked shut. She did not rush. She did not fill the silence with preamble. "We're here to close the loop," she said, voice even. "Not to celebrate, not to justify, to set a standard." The words landed with a weight that felt earned. Emily watched the faces around the table, operations, training, legal, each carrying a different version of responsibility, none pretending this was a favor. David nodded once. He had learned long ago that endings mattered less than what came after. He did not speak first. He listened. Elaine outlined the measures already in motion. The oversight panel confirmed. The revised escalation steps embedded into systems that could not be bypassed by habit. She spoke plainly, without the shine of corporate theater. When she finished, she slid a single page across the table. "This is the commitment," she said. "Publicly filed, audited, reviewed annually." David read it without expression, then passed it to Emily. Emily scanned the page and felt something settle in her chest. It was not relief. It was alignment. The language was specific, the timelines real, the accountability measurable. This was not an apology pretending to be a solution. It was a structure built to hold pressure. She looked up. "This makes room for people who don't have someone to call," she said quietly. Elaine met her eyes. That was the point. The meeting ended without ceremony. No handshakes for photographs, no statements drafted for the evening news. When they stepped outside, the air had cooled, the day loosening its grip. David paused by the railing and watched a jet climb, banking west. "This is where it sticks," he said. Emily nodded. She understood now that change survived on repetition, not recognition. Weeks passed. Summer arrived with heat and noise and motion. Emily attended the leadership program, listening more than she spoke, learning how systems bent and where they broke. She learned how to ask for clarity without apology, how to slow a room without stopping it. When it was her turn to present, She did not tell the story the way people expected. She spoke about pauses, about the power of stopping long enough to choose better. The room leaned in, not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Captain Reynolds followed the updates from a distance. He did not insert himself. He flew his routes, ran his checklists, practiced the pause he had learned the hard way. When a junior pilot asked him once why he took so long during boarding, Reynolds said, "Because time spent early saves damage later." He left it at that. The lesson did not need embellishment. Karen Mills finished her volunteer semester and signed up for another. She did not seek forgiveness. She sought practice. Each student was a reminder that assumptions formed fastest when comfort went unchallenged. She challenged it now, daily, quietly. The work was unglamorous. It mattered. At the airline, the oversight panel published its first report. Not flattering. Honest. It named gaps and set deadlines. Some executives bristled. Others leaned forward. The stock ticked along, indifferent to virtue, responsive to stability. Stability came from trust. Trust came from consistency. The system began to learn. On a clear evening, near the end of summer, Emily and David stood again near the fence by the airport, the metal warm under their hands. Planes rose and fell in measured rhythm, each one carrying hundreds of small lives intersecting for a few hours before diverging again. Emily felt the old flutter of nerves and let it pass. "I think I know what I want to do," she said. David did not ask what. He waited. "I want to work on systems," she continued. "The boring parts. The parts people ignore until they fail." David smiled, the quiet kind that did not seek credit. "That's where the future lives," he said. They watched another plane lift, the lights blinking steady against the darkening blue. Emily thought of the gate, the silence, the moment everything balanced on a breath. She thought of how small decisions multiplied, how dignity could be defended without spectacle. She understood now that belonging was not permission granted by others. It was a fact asserted by presence and protected by structure. The story would keep moving, not as a headline, but as habit. In training rooms where instructors paused a second longer. In cockpits where pilots chose evidence over instinct. In gates where a supervisor said, "Slow this down," and meant it. The work would not end. It would repeat. That was the point. Emily turned from the fence and started toward the car. The night warm and ordinary. The future wide and unafraid. If this story resonated, show your support with a like, subscribe for more, and drop 3 words in the comments. Keep doing better.